Imagine walking into a home, a house that should have been a place of safety and peace, only to discover it's nothing but an inferno. This wasn't just any fire, though. It was a deliberate act of cruelty, an act that would leave a mother dead, burned alive, and the whole community asking why. In the small hours of the morning, a woman is knocked unconscious in her own home, and just hours later, her house is set ablaze, trapping her inside. But here's the chilling part: the fire was no accident. It was a brutal, calculated attack, and the perpetrator? Someone she knew all too well. This is a story that defies reason. A twisted act of vengeance, betrayal, and unimaginable horror that begins with a seemingly trivial argument, only to spiral into something far more sinister. But who could be capable of such an act? And why would someone want to burn a mother alive? Let's dig deeper into this terrifying crime. Our story begins with the victim, Sarah Andrews, a mother in her early 40s, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Sarah was a loving single mother to her 2 children, a 15-year-old son named Liam and a 10-year-old daughter, Chloe. Known for her caring and empathetic nature, Sarah worked as a nurse at a local hospital, often putting in long shifts to provide for her family. But beneath the surface of Sarah's ordinary life, there was something darker at play. Over the years, Sarah had been in and out of relationships, but none seemed to work out. Her most recent relationship with David Carter had raised some red flags. David, a 35-year-old mechanic, was charming at first, but as time went on, his temper began to show. David and Sarah had met at a local bar about 2 years before the crime. For a while, everything seemed perfect. He would often drop by her house, helping with minor repairs and offering support. But soon, their relationship took a turn. David became possessive, controlling, and at times violently jealous. He would often show up uninvited, and there were whispers among Sarah's friends about how he seemed to be more and more unpredictable. Yet, Sarah remained in the relationship, perhaps out of hope for a better future, or because she feared what might happen if she left him. But things weren't all bad. At least that's what Sarah tried to believe. As for David, his friends began to notice how he started to exhibit strange behaviors, particularly when Sarah began spending more time at work. There were accusations, arguments, and even threats. No one could have predicted what was about to happen that night. It was a cold night in November when the events leading up to Sarah's death began to unfold. Sarah had just finished her shift at the hospital and was returning home around midnight. Her kids were asleep, as usual, and Sarah settled in for what she hoped would be a quiet evening. But David had other plans. He had been trying to get in touch with Sarah for the last couple of days, but she had been distant, not answering his calls or returning his texts. David, feeling abandoned and betrayed, showed up uninvited at her door around 1:30 a.m., angry and upset. Sarah, exhausted and frustrated with his incessant attempts to contact her, opened the door reluctantly. "What do you want, David?" she asked, her voice tired but firm. David's response was shocking. He didn't say a word. Without warning, he pushed her inside, knocking her against the wall. Sarah was dazed, but she managed to push him away. David's temper flared. "You think you can just ignore me, huh?" he snarled. "You think you can get away from me? You don't know who you're messing with." Sarah, scared now, attempted to retreat to the back of the house, but David grabbed her by the arm, pulling her toward the living room. A struggle ensued, and in the heat of the moment, David knocked Sarah unconscious. She collapsed to the floor, unable to defend herself. David, now in a rage, paced back and forth. For a moment, he stood there, unsure of what to do next. But it wasn't long before his anger turned into something more dangerous. He began searching the house, looking for something to escalate the situation. He found what he needed in the garage. David had carefully planned this moment. He didn't just come to confront Sarah in anger, he came with a purpose. It wasn't just about rage or betrayal. David had been carrying around a dark secret for months. You see, David had recently lost his job at the mechanic shop, and he had been struggling financially. But it wasn't just money that drove him to this violent act. It was a deep, twisted jealousy that festered in him over time. As Sarah grew distant and began taking more shifts at the hospital, David began to suspect that she had found someone else. In his mind, the betrayal was too much to bear. He decided to end it all to make Sarah pay for her supposed unfaithfulness. But David wasn't just angry about the relationship. He had his own deep-seated demons. The true motivation behind this crime was a desire for control, and he would stop at nothing to take back the power he felt slipping away from him. After knocking Sarah unconscious, David returned to the garage and grabbed a canister of gasoline. He carefully poured it along the hallway leading to Sarah's bedroom. Then, he lit a match and tossed it into the pool of gasoline, setting the entire house on fire. It was no accident. It was an act of deliberate destruction, a final attempt to control Sarah's life, and now her death. As the flames began to grow, David stood in the driveway, watching the fire consume the house. In his twisted mind, it was over. He had taken back what he felt was rightfully his control. He had made sure Sarah could never leave him. But just as the fire raged on, something unexpected happened. Sarah's children, Liam and Chloe, were still asleep when the fire started. It wasn't until the smoke began to billow through the house that they woke up, coughing and disoriented. In a panic, they managed to escape out of a bedroom window, but they had no idea that their mother was still trapped inside, unconscious and burning. As the fire department rushed to the scene, they battled the flames, trying to salvage what remained of the house. But it was too late for Sarah. Her body was found in the living room, severely burned, her life taken in the most horrific way imaginable. When investigators began digging into David's background, they discovered something chilling. David had been living a double life, with ties to a dangerous criminal underground that no one knew about. And worse, he had been involved in several suspicious incidents before, some that were eerily similar to the one that led to Sarah's tragic death. But here's where it gets even darker. The night of the fire, someone had witnessed David fleeing the scene, but it wasn't just him. Someone else was with him. Who else could have been involved in this gruesome act? Was David working with an accomplice? Or was there more to the story than anyone could have imagined? The investigation is ongoing, but as the authorities dig deeper into the case, the truth remains buried under layers of deception and betrayal. What will they uncover next? The fire that consumed Sarah Andrews' home was horrific, but it wasn't the last piece of the puzzle. The authorities thought they had everything figured out. David Carter was the killer. The evidence seemed irrefutable. He had been caught on surveillance cameras running from the scene. His fingerprints were found on the gasoline canister, and neighbors testified to hearing heated arguments between him and Sarah just days before the fire. But as the investigation unfolded, a shocking revelation would throw everything into question. It was a rainy Tuesday when Detective Claire Jennings, the lead investigator on the case, was sifting through the evidence one last time before heading to court. She knew she had everything she needed to put David Carter behind bars, but something nagged at her. The timing of the fire, the motive, it all made sense. But there was one thing she couldn't shake: the witness who had seen David fleeing the scene. The witness had been adamant that David wasn't alone. They described a second figure, cloaked in darkness, running beside him. At first, Claire had dismissed this as an error of perception, a result of panic in the midst of the fire. But as the days passed, the more she reviewed the footage, the more certain she became. There was someone else. The figure was barely visible, but their movements were synchronized with David's. Who was this mysterious person? Then a breakthrough came. Claire had an idea. She revisited Sarah's phone records, thinking there might be a clue there. She found something chilling. Sarah had received a strange call just hours before the fire, and it wasn't from David. The call had come from an unknown number. It was brief, lasting only 18 seconds, but it was enough to make Claire's heart race. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, but she couldn't place it. She listened to the recording again and again, trying to decipher the muffled words. And then it hit her: it was Sarah's ex-husband, Greg Andrews. Greg had been out of the picture for years, living in another state, but Sarah had always spoken of him in a calm, composed manner. There were no signs of animosity, no indication that Greg was involved in anything dangerous. But what if he was? What if he had come back to settle a score? Claire wasted no time. She tracked Greg down, finding him in a small town several hours away. When she confronted him, Greg seemed unfazed, almost too calm. But his eyes betrayed him. There was something off about his demeanor. He denied any involvement in Sarah's death, insisting that he had been in another state when the fire occurred. His alibi checked out, but Claire's instincts told her otherwise. She pressed harder, demanding to know why Sarah would have called him on the night of the fire. After several tense minutes, Greg broke down. "I didn't want to do it," he muttered, staring at the floor. "But David, he was getting out of control. He wasn't just after Sarah." At first, Claire couldn't make sense of what he was saying. But then, the pieces began to fall into place. Greg explained that David had been involved in some shady business dealings that Sarah had no idea about. He had gotten in deep with some dangerous people, and it wasn't just Sarah who was in danger. It was their children too. "I knew what David was capable of," Greg continued, his voice trembling. "I was afraid for them. I wanted to get Sarah away from him, but she wouldn't listen. So I did what I had to do." Claire's heart pounded as the gravity of his words sunk in. Did Greg orchestrate the fire? Greg went on to explain that the call Sarah made to him wasn't a cry for help, it was a warning. Sarah had realized too late that David was involved with dangerous people. She had been trying to find a way out, but it was already too late. The fire, Greg said, was meant to look like a domestic dispute gone wrong, something that would pin everything on David. But David was not the mastermind Greg was. Claire was faced with an impossible choice. She now had the confession of a man who admitted to manipulating the situation, but no clear evidence tying him to the fire itself. Greg's involvement in Sarah's death wasn't certain, and without more proof, charging him would be near impossible. It became clear that David Carter had been the victim of a setup. Someone had used him as a pawn in a much larger game. But the question remained, who was the real killer? Claire dug deeper into Greg's finances, tracing his movements, his connections. That's when she found something that made her blood run cold. Greg had recently made a large payment to a shadowy figure, someone known for handling discreet operations. The payment had been made just days before the fire, a payment that perfectly matched the price of gasoline and arson supplies. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about money, power, and control. Greg had hired someone to carry out the attack on Sarah and frame David for it. And the most disturbing part? That person was the figure seen fleeing the scene with David. With this new evidence, Claire returned to the scene of the fire, scouring the area once more. And that's when she found something small but critical, a set of distinct footprints near the back of the house, leading into the woods. The prints were too small to be David's. They were a woman's. A deep dive into Greg's history revealed a shocking detail. He had been married before, to a woman named Rachel Simmons. Rachel had disappeared under mysterious circumstances years ago, and no one had ever heard from her again. But now, Claire realized that Rachel hadn't disappeared, she had been hiding. She had been the one helping Greg orchestrate the fire, framing David and manipulating the whole situation. Rachel's involvement came as a final, devastating twist. The woman who had vanished was alive and had been working in the shadows all along. Claire immediately contacted the authorities, and with the new evidence, they tracked Rachel down. When they arrested her, she confessed to everything, confirming that Greg had orchestrated the whole thing in a desperate bid to control Sarah's life, all while using David as the perfect scapegoat. The case was finally solved. Sarah's death was tragic, and the twisted truth behind her murder was even more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The mystery was solved, but the impact of Sarah's death would haunt everyone involved. Greg and Rachel were arrested and charged with murder and conspiracy. David, finally exonerated, was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. This story is a reminder that nothing is ever as simple as it seems, and sometimes the truth is far darker than we could ever imagine. If you found this case as shocking as we did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'll keep you updated on all the latest true crime stories. Stay tuned for more chilling tales.